Greetings and welcome to the second class in the Gospel of Matthew. I'm Father Jim Kirby. And a couple of things to remember about what we're doing. I don't claim to be a biblical scholar nor a historian, but I do find these things interesting, and I have spent some time reading, looking into these various things, different sources. If you're interested in the sources that I use and the background material that I draw from, please send me an email, jkirby1@me.com, and I'd be happy to explain them. Generally, the sources that I use are John Myers, a marginal Jew. As a matter of fact, when I was in Tentour, one of the students that was there was actually editing a version of John Myers, a marginal Jew, and I can't remember what edition it was. But it's very helpful and very knowledgeable. Also, Daniel Harrington's series on Sacropagony, I use that a lot too. And so those are really helpful sources, and there's many others that you could use as complementary guide and study helps for the Gospel of Matthew. I think it's helpful if we have a bit of a review from our first class. We asked the question, some pretty basic questions like, what is a gospel? A gospel, we decided, is an attempt by authors. The four authors that we recognize as canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all four of them are trying to lay out a story, not necessarily worried about details and facts, but what they're interested in is convincing their audience and us that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. We talked about the transmission of the gospel. How did it get to where we are today? We talked about the oral tradition and how these stories and experiences first got told and retold and eventually gotten written down on parchment. We also talked a little bit about translations and the strengths and weaknesses of the different translations. We talked about the principles that translators used in translating from the Greek. And we decided that the NAB, the New American Bible, is probably at least in my opinion, the best translation to be used in a class like this. We also talked about letting Matthew be Matthew. In other words, we try not to conflate the other Gospels into Matthew's Gospel. Just we're dealing with Matthew only. Now, we'll look at the other Gospels as they compare to Matthew, but we don't want to read into Matthew's Gospel what we think we know, what we want we know, what we wish Matthew did, what we wish Matthew said. So we're going to let Matthew tell his story. We asked the question, who is Matthew? Who is Matthew, the author? We talked about the possibilities of maybe this community wrote in honor of Matthew. Maybe it was the community that Matthew founded. For our purposes, we're just going to call Matthew, Matthew, and however we define Matthew, whether he's the tax collector, the apostle of Jesus, or whether it represents a group that perhaps he founded or was representative of him. We went further and asked the question, who's his audience? Who is Matthew speaking with? That makes a big difference to understand what Matthew is saying and how he's saying it. We decided that Matthew was speaking primarily to a Jewish audience, Jewish converts and Jewish people that are interested in Christianity. And we noticed how Matthew will use symbols, sayings, and expressions in a way that Jewish people would understand or feel comfortable with. We also talked about the things that Matthew didn't do. Matthew doesn't spend a lot of time translating Hebrew for us because he already assumes that his audience understands what he's doing. So in this class, the second class, we're going to talk about certain things like the development of Matthew. How did Matthew get to where we are now? We're going to talk about exactly what a synoptic gospel is. We've mentioned it before, but we want to talk about it a little bit more detailed. We have to talk about sources. What were Matthew's sources? How did his story come about? And how is it different from Luke's and Mark's and John's? And how comfortable can we be with understanding those differences? The other thing we want to ask the question is, when was Matthew written? At what time period? How do we know? Where was his gospel written? And where do we know? And why are those things important? We're going to give you a little more information on the biblical fragments that were used in translating the Bible and putting it all together, specifically the Gospels. We're going to talk about Josephus, the historian, a separate source that has really nothing to do with the Christian movement, but Josephus was a historian at the time, and his writings are important for validating certain things of the gospel. We're going to talk about the temple and why was the temple important. More specifically, why the destruction of the temple was important for Matthew. So let's begin by talking about the biblical fragments. And when I talk about the fragments that were used in putting an accurate transition of the Bible into written word, into the Greek. So these fragments that are now being stored in various places around the world are very important, and they're very delicate. They're written on parchment. And one of the things we have to remember is that they were transmitted from Hebrew or Aramaic into the Greek. And what we have are the Greek versions or translations from the Hebrew and the Aramaic. One of the first things that we have to decide when you're translating from Hebrew or Aramaic, there are no punctuation marks. And so the first thing you have to do is figure out where the sentence ends and where it starts and all those other things. It's written right to left. And so there are some big decisions that have to be made right away by the author, whoever translated the Hebrew and Aramaic text into Greek. Our tradition tells us that St. Jerome was the first to translate from the Hebrew and the Aramaic into the Greek that we have, first and second century. And our tradition tells us that St. Jerome did his translating in the Church of the Nativity in his corner. And you can go there and see where they think that St. Jerome did all these translations. Anyway, so what Jerome or whoever translated these into Greek handed them on to various people, and they were copied and recopied through the generations. And, unfortunately, the whole thing isn't found, but there are big pieces and big fragments of the various parts of the Bible and the gospel. These fragments that we're talking about is very interesting. There's many, and perhaps we'll go into a couple of them and why they're important, and how do you decide which ones we use? That's going to be another decision that translators have to have made and before they start putting together their translation to the Bible, because you have to decide which one is the most accurate, which one is the most authentic, and those are decisions that you make by the style of the writing, whether it's clearly that they're editor notes or how many of them agree with each other. Those are some of the principles that translators have had to use through the years to put the Bible together and also to translate it. Now, through the years, obviously, complete Bibles have been translated into various languages, but it's important to get behind even those. What were the basis of these first translations? And what about the fragments? How did they use them? How do we use them today? And so I think it's important for us to talk about these various fragments that are stored all over the world, written on papyrus generally, and stored in some climate-controlled areas that are very, very important and honored in very special ways. And so there's some that are considered a little bit more important or revealing about the Bible and how we translate it. So I thought it'd be helpful if we talked about a couple of them. The first one that we need to talk about is called the Jonah Rylands manuscript. And this manuscript is dated back to 130 A.D., the 2nd century. We'll call it P52. And so that's how all these fragments are identified, by a letter and a number. This one is P52, and it's held in Manchester, England. And one of the interesting things about this P52 was that it was found in an Egyptian market in 1920. And so it's really quite amusing how these fragments, these tenets, these most important things of our faith are found. They're found in marketplaces and in old monasteries and things like that. And so some of these stories are quite humorous and sometimes almost hard to believe that these important fragments, where they were found and how they came about. This particular P52 was written on papyrus. It was written on both sides. And so that's important because that suggests that it was written in a book form. It contains descriptions or the discussion in the Gospels between Jesus and Pilate. Portions of John's Gospel are part of this fragment. They're so old that they confirm certain things, like this particular one confirms that John's Gospel was written at the end of the 1st century. In one of the commentaries written about this particular fragment, P52, Tim Calais talks about this particular fragment, and he says, quote, "This little scrap of papyrus is our oldest historical link to the New Testament scriptures. It represents the thousands of manuscripts and fragments of manuscripts that have survived through the centuries," unquote. And so you can see how these different fragments have more and more significance than some of the others. This one is particularly helpful in a lot of different ways, and so deserves to have a lot more weight than the others. Another important fragment is called the Bodmer Papyrus number 2, and it is dated at 150 to 200 AD. It was discovered by Martin Bodmer. I don't have a lot of information on where or how it was discovered, but it's contained at the Bodmer Library of World Literature in, near Geneva, Switzerland. It's among approximately 160,000 items. It's the copy of the Gutenberg Bible is based on this. And so if you ever wonder how big these fragments are, well, this is quite large, 160,000 different pieces of this particular group. And so this particular group contains fragments that are called P66, P72, and P75, and they're some of the earliest Christian writings. Particularly P66 was dated before the 2nd century and earlier, so as early as 150, and it contains most of John's Gospel. This is a writing that is 1 century removed from the time of the original text was written, and so this is very important. Another part of this group is called P72, and it's the earliest copy of the Epistle of Jude, the 2 epistles of Peter. They date these particular parts of P72 to around 175 up to 225 AD. It's the earliest known copy of the Gospel according to Luke and one of the earliest of the Gospel according to John. Okay, so maybe you're getting weary of my excitement over these fragments, but let's talk about one more. And we talked about this in the first class. It's called the Diasasaran. And it is written, dated to 170 AD. Diasasaran means a harmony of 4. And as we learned earlier, it was written or put together by a writer, author called Tatian. He was a writer from the 2nd century, and what he tried to do was combine all 4 canonical Gospels into one single harmonious narrative. So Tatian used the wording that he had for all the Gospels, the original wording, the best he can. And so he tried to put the different verses and stories in the sequence that made sense to him in following the life of Jesus. It was a standard gospel text that was used in liturgy and the Syrian church, among others, for 2 centuries. It is significant because it's an early manuscript that the remaining copies bear witness to the other earlier gospel fragments that were discovered as well. Well, you might be asking yourself, okay, so what's so important about this? Well, there's a lot of reasons to be interested in these things. You know, there is more than 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts that took all these fragments together and became one thing. And there's, If you put them all together, that's 2.6 million pages of things that were written back in the earliest parts of the church. And if you put them all together, here's a little visual for you. It would equal, if you put all these pages together, 1 mile just of the New Testament manuscripts and 2.5 million miles of the entire Bible. So you put those together, and so this is significant because this is what our faith is based on. If you want to put this in context of some other old manuscripts that were put in, are still around, the old manuscripts, the actual fragments of old manuscripts like the Odyssey, for example, combining all those, you would have 4 feet of manuscripts. So that tells you how many fragments have first and second and third century fragments that are dated back to then make up the Bible, and there's more, astronomically more authentic pages for the Bible than any other popular manuscript from the same time period. Well, you might be saying, thank goodness we're not talking about fragments anymore. Well, pardon my delving into these particular things, but that's what I really enjoy about doing this kind of study, is because it gets in and mixes up the details, and it makes it more real for me, and it challenges me to think broadly and more deeply about certain things. And so that's why I do it. So now let's talk for a moment about the Synoptic Gospels. What is a Synoptic Gospel? Synoptic is a word that means through one lens, or looking at it in one way, that they're similar. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the Synoptic Gospels because they're written in a very similar way from very similar sources, and so that's why they're synoptic, and that's why John is not. John really has very little to do with the other Gospels. There's many stories that go with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John is written in such a different way. One other thing to remember as we go through this is what's wrong with the non-canonical Gospels, such as St. Thomas and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And these are important writings, but the reason that they're not accepted as canonical is because their literary style, the biblical scholarship of the time demonstrates that they are not dated back far enough. They're dated 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century, and it's really clear when you start looking at the style of Greek that they're written in, and it's very obvious that they're written in a style of the time that is far removed from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. So now let's discuss the differences of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we have to ask ourselves, what's the source? Mostly the sources we talk about are going to be about the way that these 3 Gospels agree with each other. They all generally have the same outline and the same stories, but they're told in different ways. And Matthew and Luke have sources, obviously, and stories that Mark doesn't have. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what sources are they using that the others aren't? What sources does Matthew have that Luke doesn't? Matthew's infancy narrative is completely different than Luke's. Mark doesn't have one. And so Matthew has his own source that he's using that Luke and Mark do not. The other thing that's common to the Synoptic Gospels and also to John's Gospel is their use of what is called a Q source. Now, a Q source, it's for quell. It's Q for quell, which is a German word that means source. So how do we know that there is this Q source? There's no written form of the Q. Scholars believe that it was already translated into Greek, but clearly Matthew, Mark, and Luke had this source that they use. The Q source generally has speeches by Jesus, words of Jesus, sayings of Jesus, experience and descriptions of Jesus that were written not necessarily in a certain context, but it's a list of all these different things, and I'm not smart enough to decide how they figured this out, but most biblical scholars identify this Q source as something that Matthew, Mark, and Luke had in front of them, the sayings and experiences of Jesus that were put together not necessarily in context. So the first thing that Mark, Matthew, and Luke had to do was to figure out how to put these things in order. So another part of this source discussion that we have to have is about Mark. Mark appears to be the first gospel. That's what most scholars believe. And it appears that Matthew and Luke both have a version of Mark in front of them. In other words, they know Mark's gospel and they use it. Matthew and Luke take Mark's gospel and edit it freely. They don't worry so much about the way Mark ordered it. They spend more time explaining things. They make it more in a story form than Mark did. Mark is this quick, rapid succession of things that just you're exhausted by the time you're finished reading Mark because it's so quick. The sources, again, they're unique stories to, it says sorties here on our graphic, but obviously I meant stories. They're different stories that different gospels have, and John has his own sources. And so Matthew has his own source in addition to Mark's gospel and the Q source. Well, I talked way more than I thought I was going to talk, and I got a bit verbose. And you're probably saying to yourself, oh, I need a break. Well, I'm going to give you a break. I'm going to split this class up into two parts. This is 2A, and then we'll have a 2B that will come shortly.